It was May 2, 1945. The war in Europe had 5 more days to live. In a small Bavarian town called Oberammergau, American soldiers from the 44th Infantry Division kicked down the door of a modest Alpine cottage. They were searching for weapons, SS officers in hiding, anything that might pose a threat. What they found instead was a middle-aged man with wire-rimmed glasses, sitting calmly at a kitchen table, sipping ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. His hands were steady, his expression almost serene. On the table in front of him lay a stack of technical drawings, a fountain pen, and a leather-bound notebook filled with equations that would one day put men on the moon. His name was Wernher von Braun, and he had been waiting for them. "I surrender to the American forces," he said in practiced English. "I have information that will be valuable to your country." The soldiers looked at each other, confused. This wasn't a Nazi officer. This wasn't a war criminal begging for mercy. This was a businessman making a pitch. In that moment, without realizing it, those soldiers had just become the first participants in one of the most controversial, morally complex, and strategically brilliant operations in American history. It was called Operation Paperclip. It would bring over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to the United States, many of them former Nazis, some war criminals, all invaluable. They would build America's rockets. They would design America's jets. They would lay the foundation for America's space program, chemical weapons research, and Cold War technological dominance. But the cost, the moral weight of what was done to secure that advantage, would haunt the nation for decades. Because Wernher von Braun didn't just build rockets, he built them with slave labor. 3 weeks earlier, inside a cramped office at the Pentagon, a different kind of war was beginning. Colonel Holger Toftoy sat hunched over intelligence reports, smoking his 4th cigarette of the hour. The reports were terrifying. The Soviets were moving fast. They had already captured the German rocket facility at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast. They were strip mining German technology, rounding up scientists, dismantling factories piece by piece. Stalin wanted rockets. He wanted jet engines. He wanted every German secret weapon that could give him an edge in whatever came next. Toftoy knew what came next. The alliance with the Soviets was already fracturing. Churchill had warned about an Iron Curtain. Truman was receiving intelligence briefs that painted a grim picture. The next war, if it came, wouldn't be fought with infantry and tanks. It would be fought with technology, speed, and weapons that didn't yet exist. America had the atomic bomb, but delivery systems were primitive. The B-29 bombers that dropped Fat Man and Little Boy were slow, vulnerable, detectable. What if you could put a warhead on a rocket that traveled faster than sound? What if you could strike from thousands of miles away? What if you could reach space itself? The Germans had been asking those questions for years, and they had answers. Toftoy drafted a memo that would change history. It was titled "Exploitation of German Scientists in Guided Missile Development." The language was clinical, bureaucratic, cold. It proposed bringing German rocket scientists to the United States under military custody. Their Nazi affiliations would be overlooked. Their crimes would be redacted. Their value to American security would outweigh all other considerations. President Truman read the memo. He hesitated. He had seen the photographs from Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, from camps where German engineers had worked Jews, Poles, and Soviet prisoners to death building rockets. He knew what kind of men these were, but he also knew what kind of world was coming. On September 3, 1946, Truman signed the order. Operation Overcast, as it was first called, became Operation Paperclip, named after the paperclips used to attach new, falsified biographies to the scientists' dossiers. Their Nazi pasts were quietly erased. Their SS memberships were downplayed. Their complicity in war crimes was buried under layers of classification. And just like that, the United States made a deal with the devil. The only question was whether the devil would keep his end of the bargain. Wernher von Braun was born in 1912 to Prussian aristocracy. His father was a baron. His mother gave him a telescope for his confirmation. He became obsessed with the stars, with flight, with the idea that humanity could break free from Earth's gravity. By age 20, he was working with the German Society for Space Travel, launching primitive liquid fuel rockets in abandoned fields outside Berlin. By age 25, he was the technical director of the German Army's rocket program at Peenemünde, overseeing thousands of engineers and a budget that dwarfed anything in America. He wasn't a soldier. He was a dreamer, but he made a choice. To fund his dreams, he would build weapons. The V-2 rocket was his masterpiece, 50 feet tall, 13 tons, capable of reaching speeds over 3,500 miles per hour. It could strike London from launch sites in Holland. No warning, no defense, just a sonic boom followed by obliteration. Between September 1944 and March 1945, over 3,000 V-2 rockets were launched at Allied cities. They killed roughly 9,000 people, including 2,700 civilians in London alone. But here's the grotesque irony. More people died building the V-2 than were killed by it. At a place called Mittelwerk, buried inside a mountain in central Germany, 60,000 concentration camp prisoners were forced to assemble rockets in underground tunnels. They worked 18-hour shifts. They slept on wooden planks. They ate watery soup and moldy bread. If they collapsed, they were beaten. If they sabotaged parts, they were hanged in front of the others as a warning. An estimated 20,000 prisoners died at Mittelwerk. Von Braun visited the site multiple times. He toured the tunnels. He inspected the production lines. He signed off on requests for more slave labor. Years later, when asked about Mittelwerk, von Braun would claim he was unaware of the conditions. He insisted he was a scientist, not a guard, focused on rockets, not politics. But documents tell a different story. In 1944, von Braun joined the SS. He later claimed it was compulsory, that Himmler himself had insisted. Maybe that was true. Maybe he had no choice. Or maybe he saw which way the wind was blowing and decided his career was worth the compromise. By May 1945, with Germany collapsing, von Braun made another choice. He gathered his top engineers, loaded trucks with blueprints and documents, and fled south toward the advancing American lines. He could have surrendered to the Soviets. They were closer, but he knew the Americans would pay more, and he was right. On September 20th, 1945, Wernher von Braun and 6 of his top engineers arrived at Fort Strong in Boston Harbor. They were classified as wards of the Army, not prisoners, not immigrants, something in between. They were given medical exams, new clothes, and temporary housing. Intelligence officers interviewed them about Soviet capabilities, German weapons research, and what they could offer America. Von Braun's pitch was simple. Give me a budget, give me a facility, and I will give you the future. Within months, he and his team were relocated to Fort Bliss, Texas, and later to the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. They were kept under military supervision, but were free to work, free to publish research, and eventually free to bring their families over from Germany. The American public knew nothing. The press wasn't informed. The scientists were told to keep low profiles. Official records listed them as specialists or technical consultants. Their Nazi pasts were scrubbed from files. But inside the military-industrial complex, word spread quickly. The Germans weren't just good, they were a generation ahead. By 1946, von Braun's team had begun reconstructing V-2 rockets using parts smuggled out of Germany. They launched them at White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. The first test flights were shaky, uncontrolled, but they flew. Each launch taught Americans something they didn't know. Within a year, the U.S. Army had a functional ballistic missile program. Within 5 years, they had rockets capable of carrying nuclear warheads. Within 15 years, they had the Saturn V, the most powerful rocket ever built, designed under von Braun's direction. But the cost of that progress, the moral compromise at the heart of it, was something America would struggle to reconcile. Von Braun wasn't the only one. He was just the most famous. Operation Paperclip brought over 1,600 German scientists and technicians. Some were world-class experts. Others were opportunists. A few were monsters. Take Hubertus Strughold, known as the father of space medicine. He conducted experiments on human endurance, studying how pilots could survive high altitudes and extreme temperatures. His research was invaluable to NASA, but his methods were inhumane. At Dachau, prisoners were subjected to freezing experiments, submerged in ice water for hours to see how long a downed pilot could survive. Many died. Others suffered permanent damage. Strughold claimed he wasn't directly involved, but his name appeared on reports. He knew. After the war, Strughold was brought to the United States under Paperclip. He became chief scientist at the Air Force School of Aviation Medicine and helped design pressure suits, oxygen systems, and life support technology used in the Mercury and Gemini programs. When journalists later uncovered his past, there was outrage, but by then he had already retired. No charges were filed. Then there was Kurt Blome, a high-ranking Nazi doctor who experimented with biological weapons, including plague vaccines tested on concentration camp prisoners. Blome was arrested after the war and tried at Nuremberg. He was acquitted due to lack of evidence, though many believed the verdict was political. 2 years later, he was recruited by the U.S. Army Chemical Corps and worked on American bioweapon programs until the late 1950s, quietly returning to Germany afterward. Arthur Rudolph, von Braun's deputy and production manager at Mittelwerk, oversaw the slave labor operation. He signed documents requesting more prisoners and was present when workers were hanged for sabotage. After the war, Rudolph came to the U.S. and became a key figure in the Saturn V program, receiving NASA's Distinguished Service Medal. In 1984, investigators uncovered his wartime record, and he renounced his U.S. citizenship rather than face prosecution. These weren't isolated cases, they were the norm. Operation Paperclip prioritized results over morality, expertise over accountability, and the justification was always the same: if we don't take them, the Soviets will. The Americans were right to worry. The Soviets were doing the same thing. In spring 1945, as U.S. forces swept southern Germany, Soviet troops stormed into the industrial heartland of the East. They captured factories, laboratories, and research facilities, rounding up German scientists at gunpoint. Operation Osoaviakim, the Soviet equivalent of Paperclip, was more brutal and less selective. Entire families were loaded onto trains in the middle of the night and deported to the USSR. Some scientists went willingly, lured by good pay and prestigious positions. Others had no choice. Helmut Gröttrup, one of von Braun's top engineers, stayed behind in Soviet-occupied territory. The Soviets immediately put him to work. For nearly a decade, Gröttrup and hundreds of German engineers helped the USSR build its ballistic missile program, reverse engineering the V-2 and designing propulsion systems that would eventually launch Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin into space. But the Soviets never trusted them. They were under constant surveillance. By the late 1950s, once Soviet engineers had absorbed all they needed, most Germans were sent back to East Germany. The space race wasn't just a competition between superpowers. It was a competition between two groups of German engineers building weapons for opposite sides of the Cold War. By the late 1950s, von Braun had become an American icon. He appeared on television, consulted on Disney films about space travel, and wrote articles for popular magazines, painting a utopian vision of humanity's future among the stars. In 1958, his team launched Explorer 1, America's first satellite, in response to the Soviet Union's Sputnik. It was a propaganda victory, a technological triumph, and personal vindication for von Braun, but not everyone cheered. Jewish groups protested his past. Survivors of Mittelwerk wrote letters demanding accountability. Journalists began digging into Operation Paperclip, uncovering falsified records, buried war crimes, and deliberate cover-ups. Von Braun's response was always the same: regret, claimed ignorance, insisted he was a scientist, not a Nazi. For decades, America accepted that answer because it needed to. In 1969, von Braun stood in the control room at Kennedy Space Center and watched Apollo 11 lift off, carrying Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins to the moon. It was the culmination of his lifelong dream, proof humanity could reach beyond Earth. But it was also built on suffering. The same hands that designed Saturn V had once signed requisitions for slave labor. The same mind that put men on the moon had calculated trajectories for weapons that killed thousands. That paradox, this uncomfortable truth, is the legacy of Operation Paperclip. Was it worth it? Historians have debated for decades. On one hand, the technological advantages were undeniable. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, satellite technology, jet propulsion, space exploration, achieved decades faster than otherwise possible. These technologies weren't just military. They enabled GPS, weather forecasting, telecommunications, medical imaging, and countless innovations benefiting humanity today. On the other hand, the moral cost was staggering. The U.S. knowingly harbored war criminals, falsified records, bypassed immigration laws, and denied justice to Nazi victims, all in the name of national security. It set a precedent. If ends justify means, if expertise outweighs accountability, where do you draw the line? What other compromises become acceptable? Some argue paperclip was a necessary evil. The Cold War demanded hard choices. Refusing to recruit Nazi scientists would have handed them to the Soviets. Others argue that some principles should never be compromised, that justice matters more than victory, and that America betrayed its own values by protecting men who committed crimes against humanity. Both arguments have merit, both are incomplete. The truth is messier than either side wants to admit. In 1984, the U.S. Department of Justice created the Office of Special Investigations to hunt Nazi war criminals living in America. They reviewed thousands of cases, including many paperclip scientists. Arthur Rudolph was forced to leave. A handful of others were investigated, but most were never charged. By then, they were elderly, the evidence old, and political will lacking. Von Braun died in 1977, never tried. Hubertus Strughold died in 1986, still honored in textbooks. Kurt Blom died in 1969, forgotten by history. Victims, prisoners who built the rockets. Families lost to V-2 strikes, received no apologies. No reparations, no acknowledgement. In 1985, a reporter asked a former Mittelwerk prisoner about von Braun's role in the moon landing. The man in his 70s stared at the floor before answering. "I'm glad we went to the moon," he said quietly. "But I wish someone else had taken us there." Today, Operation Paperclip is a footnote in most history books. The moral complexity is flattened. The U.S. recruited German scientists after World War II, but the implications run deeper. Paperclip taught the American government that morality could be negotiable when national security was at stake. It established a template for covert operations, plausible deniability, and the quiet rewriting of inconvenient truths. It also forces a question every generation must answer. What are we willing to sacrifice to win? And what does winning even mean if we lose ourselves in the process? The Saturn V rocket remains one of humanity's greatest achievements. The moon landing, a moment of unparalleled triumph. But beneath that triumph lies a shadow, a reminder that progress often comes at a price. And history is never simple. Von Braun once said, "I aim for the stars, but sometimes I hit London," a joke about early rockets' inaccuracy. But it became something else, a confession. Dreams and destruction are sometimes born from the same hands. So what do we do with that knowledge? How do we reconcile the fact that some of our greatest achievements were built by people who committed unspeakable acts? We could erase them from history, but that would be dishonest. They did the work. They built the rockets. Denying it doesn't change reality. We could celebrate them as heroes, focusing only on their contributions and ignoring the darkness. But that would betray the victims, or we could do something harder. We could hold both truths at once. Acknowledge that von Braun was a brilliant engineer and a Nazi collaborator, that his rockets took us to the moon and killed thousands, that Operation Paperclip gave America a technological edge and compromised its moral authority. History is not a story of pure good defeating pure evil. It's flawed people making impossible choices in desperate times, and the consequences echo forward, shaping the world today. The scientists brought to America didn't just build rockets. They built institutions, trained the next generation of engineers, and established research programs that still exist. Their legacy is technical, cultural, ethical, and philosophical. Innovation is never in a vacuum. It is shaped by politics, war, and moral compromise. The next great technological leap, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, autonomous weapons, will raise the same questions. We will have to weigh benefits against costs and live with the consequences. Operation Paperclip shows what happens when victory is prioritized over principle. Sometimes the ends justify the means, sometimes they don't, and sometimes we don't realize which it was until it's too late. In 1975, 2 years before his death, Wernher von Braun gave his final public interview. Frail, soft-spoken, he was asked if he had any regrets. He paused, then said, I regret that we did not go to the moon sooner. I regret that I could not do more. He did not mention Middelwerk, the prisoners, or the V2 strikes on London. Perhaps he blocked it out. Perhaps he believed himself blameless. Or perhaps he knew some sins are too great to confess. When he died in 1977, newspapers celebrated his achievements. The man who took us to the moon, the father of American rocketry. Few mention the shadow behind the light, but history remembers both. The rockets and the suffering, the triumph and the compromise, the science and the silence, and it asks us to answer the same question von Braun never did. How far would you go to reach the stars?